What is our Dharma? What is our quest? How's it going, everyone? Thanks for tuning in. Today I thought I would talk about quests and why I'm kind of enamored with this concept. And it's not even really just why I'm personally enamored with the concept, but I think it can be kind of a redemptive thing for people in general, or an energizing thing when someone adopts a quest into their life. And we're in this habit of kind of going through a day-to-day life if we're not careful. Whatever is the order of the day, whatever are the particular urgent exchanges that demand our attention, that can very easily just kind of take over and fill in a checkerboard of our life without us necessarily having a say in it. It's very easy to get lost in a life that's quote-unquote designed that way, where it's not intentional, and life just kind of happens to you. But whether we're talking about in a spiritual sense, like an explicitly spiritual one, or whether we're talking about an existential or just like purely psychologically driven kind of question of how you're going to spend your life energies, it's pretty hard to beat quests. And I'm not speaking from the viewpoint of someone who's always had a quest. I've had times in my life where I had extraordinary drive to complete certain quests. I've had other times in my life where I just dedicated my time to letting things kind of happen to me in a way, or if not exactly being like completely passive in that sense, then at least not necessarily making some grand design. I've had periods of my life where I was just free to experiment, whether it be like with art or, martial arts, or even just kind of like diddling around in my career, doing whatever I felt like doing in times where I didn't have like extraordinarily high stress kind of demands. But there have been other times where I was pretty singularly focused on one or another kind of quest. And it's entirely possible that a life well lived has alternating segments where it's quest, and then other times it's just sort of open-ended exploration. And I could very easily, like if someone said that to me, I could very easily agree with it. But I will say that the times where I've had a quest, it opened up dimensions in myself that previously weren't there, and it was very good for self-expansion, growth, acquisition of new skills, for the stimulation of emotions that I didn't even know that I had, becoming a different kind of person fundamentally. Like whatever that quest demanded in terms of what kind of person I would need to be to complete it, or even just to be on the journey of completing that quest, they had a way of manifesting. Where if I didn't have that quest, it's not something that would have happened necessarily. There are certain things that just don't happen by accident. So if you notice, I've been using the word quest a lot and not necessarily goal. We have a very goal-oriented society in a lot of ways. It's certainly in America. And you could just as easily make the argument that we have a society that's absolutely not goal-oriented, and they just sort of seek out endless bits of dopamine stimulation or entertainment or diversion, whatever. And this has preceded digital devices. This has been like, people sitting around listening to radio or watching TV, like the proverbial couch potato. But there has at least been a dichotomy where there have been like very quote-unquote goal-oriented people kind of set against people who are not necessarily goal-oriented. And for me, that has like kind of a stink to it. And that could be because the goal orientation very often in our society, like some goals will be recognized and some won't. So for example, like if you had artistic goals that were very important to you, and they like in order to meet your artistic goals, you had to do outstanding cycles of growth and expansion and skill acquisition and all this other sorts of thing. But like a business person might have looked at that and been like, I don't get it. I don't value it. So there's goals and goals, if you know what I mean. But when I talk about quests, this is something that's a little bit, for me, on a higher order. Not even just higher order, like, oh, it means like it's a spiritual one that is somehow tied to a quest for ultimate reality or a search for ultimate reality or whatever. I'm not even necessarily talking about that. This could be purely in terms of material world pursuits that don't necessarily have anything to do with explicitly spiritual gains or topics or whatever. Like, I could be, I don't know, like, let's just say I'm an MMA fighter and that it was my quest to become the champion. That's, for me, it's easier to say something like it's my quest to become like the best champion ever than it would be to say, oh, it's my goal. So just to expand on that, if I were in a company and I had a like meeting that I had to go to monthly, quarterly, whatever, and I had a boss saying like, what's your goal for this quarter? What's your goal for the year? There's definitely something very mundane about that. It would be hard for me to imagine saying, like, being in a meeting like that and having the boss say, what's your quest this quarter? What's your quest this year? If, people saying that kind of stuff in a business setting would be looked at very strangely. But, people could certainly say, I have a goal to be like the best MMA fighter in the world or whatever. They could certainly say, I have a goal to achieve some spiritual thing, and it would be sensible. But for me, there's something very special in terms of a difference, certainly in connotation, but also like, in the internal experience of meaning when you say, I have a quest to do these things. And for me, what's one of those differences? If you achieve a goal or you don't achieve a goal, there's definitely a very different acceptability for that. There's a different experience in your life, both as it's given to you externally by others and in how you think of it yourself and how you think of yourself. So if I fail to meet a goal, like, oh man, that can be terrible. It can feel like crap. It could just be like a crushing experience. But sometimes quests can last your entire life. Or at least like a quest can be this prolonged campaign that takes a very long time. And it can include seasons of being up. It can include seasons of being down. It can include seasons of great triumph, and it can include seasons of wandering around in the wasteland, so to speak, of your despair or whatever else. So that's something very different for me when we talk about goals versus quests. Now, interestingly enough, when I teach yoga classes, very often, just like a lot of other yoga teachers out there, this is not something of my invention. We will talk about setting an intention. And my little spiel usually is that an intention, as opposed to a goal, can be something that just lasts for the duration of your practice. It could be an intention that lasts that long, but then is also the same intention you set the next day. So that it's just like this intention that you can keep repeating and repeating and repeating each time you step to your mat. It can be something like that that's extended over the course of your lifetime, and that's great. That's fine. Intentions are very sliceable and diceable that way. And I think in some ways people who set intentions like that actually do better than people who set quote-unquote goals, like particularly when they just fall in love with the process of whatever they're doing. And there's been some studies I've read back and forth that support that. In my own personal experience, I can say that in my martial arts journey, when I had like quote unquote goals that depended on me getting to another belt color, or depended on me like performing in a certain way at a tournament or something like that, it was very easy for those goals to become frustrated. And in turn, for me to get frustrated with the process, because if I didn't achieve the goal, then, oh no, what do we do now? Right? You're suddenly, should failure come up, you're suddenly in that world where you have failed. And that's a very dark place to be sometimes. So if you don't have some sort of system that has an allowance for failure as some sort of stepping stone to ultimate success, for a lot of people, that can be like kind of a big psychological hurdle. And it can really interfere with whether or not they ultimately do achieve whatever they would have said was their quote unquote goal. So for me, falling in love with the process and just forgetting about like slicing and dicing my process into a bunch of goals where it would be frustrating for me if I didn't reach it. That's ultimately what was the path for success for me. And everyone's mileage might vary, but, I was performing a lot more poorly when I was so concerned about whether or not, like for jiu-jitsu, if I was grappling this guy and he beat me, and if I was grappling that guy and he beat me, like if that became the narrative where it was like, whether it was a guy beating me just in my own gym, like a training partner, or a guy beating me in a tournament, that was like, for me personally, a very frustrating way to think, and one that actually set up obstacles for my success. But when I fell in love with the process and I just set an intention each time I stepped on the practice mat with my training partners to have fun, like if my intention was, let's play, let's have fun, let's allow myself to learn, let's experiment, let's see things that work and find out things that don't work, and think of it the way a scientist does, where a scientist doesn't say, oh my God, my hypothesis was wrong, I'm a horrible excuse for whatever, like I'm not a real scientist. No, scientific process includes failure as a crucial component, because you falsify like whatever doesn't work, right? And then you can focus on whatever does work. And it's not that falling in love with the process is meant to be scientific, although it has that same freedom to experiment. Falling in love with the process has more of like sort of a way of embracing with joy and with a sense of play whatever you're doing. So it has some similarities with a scientific method or a scientific mindset, but it's like aesthetically and psychologically, there's definitely a lot different of a set of emotions that you invest into it and that you operationalize. So like the happiest that I ever was when I just went with a spirit of play and experimentation and fell in love with the process. When I would say, isn't it interesting how this move worked and this one didn't? Rather than, this person beat me, or, this tournament I didn't do well. And literally night and day, as soon as I switched from a goal mindset to an intention mindset, my performance, almost as if by a paradox, suddenly just got night and day difference. And almost as if by accident, I achieved all the things that I had set as quote unquote goals before, but only once I had deliberately turned my back on setting those goals. So once I got to like purple belt, brown, whatever, when people would ask if my goal was to get my black belt, I would say no. And that shocked a lot of people, particularly because in our culture, they would say things like, they would judge people if they were not quote unquote goal oriented or ambitious. But a lot of the same people like who would say that kind of thing from the outside looking in had never gone through that process and learned like just how unforgiving it can be if people approach it with mindsets that ultimately sabotage them. So I promise I'm tying this back into the quest mentality a little bit. There's a little bit of a parallel here. A quest mentality transcends intentions, it transcends goals, and it can encompass a very long game mentality. Meaning like you have to know going into it that if you have a quest, there might be very long winters along the way. It takes a very special person, or it takes you becoming a very special kind of person to willingly, on purpose, declare that you have a quest and to dedicate your life to it. So the quest can be a fundamentally life-transforming experience, and it changes how you approach your life in every single way. And by comparison, in my opinion, goal-setting behavior can be kind of shallow because it's too success or failure oriented at too many points in the process, versus like the unshakable willingness to say, I'm not going anywhere. I might not succeed at a quote unquote goal at every interval along the way, but the long game is what I care about. And just to make another parallel, I talked about my own experience in martial arts, and like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it takes a really long time to get black belts. Most people quit after blue belt. Much higher number of people quit at blue belt than at any other belt. And then along the way, there's an attrition rate where people just fall off and they fall off and they fall off. And there are people who show up who shoot out of a cannon with talent. Like everyone thinks, oh, they're gonna go places. They're gonna be so great. But over the long durée of their life, things come up that knock them off the path. Even if they came in with all kinds of talent and everyone like just immediately, wisely or not, invested all these expectations in them. But when I look around the room at the people who ended up in that particular martial art with an extraordinarily high attrition rate, none of the people to my right and my left, or almost none, I can think of like maybe one person, were people that were there when I started. It's a huge, huge, huge pyramid. And the only people who actually did stick around, very few of them were the people that everyone was like, oh, that person's going to be the best forever, or they're really going places or whatever. Maybe like one or two. But the rest of them were just people who were too dumb to quit. And they weren't even necessarily the biggest ambition setters. They might, they would compete here and there, and that's great. They might not have even been the ones who were in the dojo every single night. They might have been the ones who were there like, I can manage 3 or 4 nights a week, but I'm going to do that consistently. And maybe they were the people who like made some sort of conscious effort to actually tailor their own training experience above and beyond exactly what their teacher prescribed in ways that worked for them. So these are all things that make a difference in someone who do these things that take, like, if not a lifetime, although it can take a lifetime to get a black belt in that particular martial art, then if not that, then at least like, a decade or two at a time. And think of all the things that can happen in someone's life in a decade or two of time. All the calamities, all the twists, turns, plot changes. I mean, all those things that can happen in that length of time. But one constant was that the person stuck around because, quote unquote, they were too dumb to quit. And a lot of these people, I would even say that, for most of the years that they were training, they may have been getting ragdolled around by almost everyone in the room. But over time, they just kind of stuck with it until eventually they were like, you could put them in front of anyone and they'd be able to give them a hard time. And I mean anyone. Or they'd at least be able to like hold their own. But they were just too dumb to quit, right? And a lot of those people, it's not that I would say that they said they had a quest, but they have something in common with what it takes to do a quest. A quest is something that has to be able to endure all kinds of seasons, all those same twists and turns. By the time you begin a quest, and if it is a quest that even has an ending, you will absolutely not be the same kind of person. So there's like a mind trip just to take in about that concept of a quest. Not only should a quest change who you are fundamentally from your point A to your point Z, but it definitely will. You will not be the same person for several reasons. For all the things you've endured from this point to that, and just like along the way to completing your quest, things that weren't even instrumental to completing your quest. But you'll certainly be changed by the things that were directly related to your quest as well. Doing anything for that long, you're definitely several times over not going to be the same kind of person. But another metaphor to use here is like, there's that whole, if you don't throw out a net, even passively, you'll never catch the fish. Like, if you don't throw out a line, even passively, you'll never catch the fish. So even if you're just if that's all you're doing is just putting that net there and putting out that line, but multiplied over a huge length of time, you end up catching lots and lots and lots and lots of fish. But you would have caught zero if having that net wasn't part of your journey, right? So having a quest and declaring it can be kind of setting out that net where you're going to be catching all kinds of experiences and knowledge and skills that you never would have caught if you hadn't put that net out, right? So there's all kinds of parallels we can draw here to, other concepts like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, like what made the difference between his experience in the concentration camp and everybody else who maybe didn't make it, he was able to frame his experience with some kind of meaning, right? So that's like one of the notes in this make a quest thing. But there's also times where you're too weak to do something for yourself. Like if just existing for your own sake just isn't really enough to get you lightning bolted out of bed, then having a quest where parts of it are dependent on other people, or that like your quest is something where suddenly those people depend on you. That's another huge part of what can keep you going, even when other things can't. And quests can have a much more flexible and changeable and mutable makeup of intentions, goals, if you want to include those, and longer term goals. But the quest is the thing that binds them all together. And it's like even declaring a quest is kind of a magic spell in and of itself, because language is powerful, just like any NLP people will tell you. When you say something, and when you say you're going to do something, or when you say you are someone, and if you believe it, it becomes true. And sometimes that's over a shorter period of time, sometimes it's over a longer period of time. But when you declare that quest, it is a magic spell in that sense. And part of the reason that this is on my mind is I think there is such a thing as a therapeutic method of helping people get in touch with a quest if they feel like they're lost in their life or meaningless, and saying like, what were the things that invited magic into your life when you did feel magic? What were the things that invited energy and lightning into your life and added a spring in your step when you did? And like kind of getting them back in touch with that particular part of their spirit, and then like putting the rest of their life, helping them put themselves for the rest of their life on a trajectory to complete some kind of quest. I think that can be a fundamentally transformative thing. And on a personal note, this is something that I'm doing now. My quest is kind of bubbling up a little bit. There's like a little Venn diagram overlap of some different things that are coming together where I haven't quite gotten the language to sum it all up yet, but these things are kind of drifting together, where for a long time at other points in my life, I did have quests that did last most of my life, right? Like lifelong writer related quests, or martial arts, or music. Like I've done things in those areas that took my whole life up to now to be able to do, and to do a lot of it, and to do it in a way that I thought was like in some parts masterful, but most of the time at least like competent, right? But most importantly, that it had something to do with me on a deep personal level. But now I'm getting to the point where, having turned 40 recently, it's like a completely different phase of my life, where now I'm like, okay, I'm literally over the first hill, and what am I doing for the rest of it? And it can be a very powerful exercise. And even though I have had this ambivalent relationship with goals in the past, and I mentioned a few reasons why, I'm now also reconsidering goals and goal setting in a different way, so long as I can kind of plug it into a quest framework, or like I can have a quest underlying it all. And there's to get into more detail, there's a book by a guy named Tom Shea that my friend Jinx has kind of turned me on to, where it's all about like setting up very, very explicit goals with a no excuses attitude, which in the past I've bristled at, and I mentioned a few reasons why. But now that I've kind of like matured in a lot of ways and collected a lot more tools, coming back to this idea of setting goals kind of ambitiously and aggressively, but specifically also tying it to my notion of a quest, I have a feeling like I'm on the brink of like a pretty powerful transition if I commit to it seriously. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I just kind of wanted to share some of my musings about what it means to be on a quest. And one of the other things that I didn't really mention as much is like for me, the best kinds of quests are ones that transcend your own desires for your own sake, but that specifically make the world a better place in some way or another, or that specifically bring value back to your community. So, if the knight is on the quest to slay the dragon or whatever, maybe that has some note of his own personal glory in it, but it's because the dragon is terrorizing the village or whatever, right? or if the knight is on the quest for the Holy Grail, maybe some part of it begins out of like, a sense of glory or whatever, but ultimately it's about bringing back the redemptive miracle to his people. And those are all the kind of ideas that are bubbling up in my soul, and in increasingly powerful ways, the more that it ferments and the more it takes shape for me. If I feel like any of these thoughts or ideas or ruminations can have value for any of you guys listening, I will certainly share them. But in the meantime, if you're thinking about your own kind of quests or goals or intentions, maybe let some of the things that I've mentioned kind of like poke and prod some of those ideas a little bit and see if they have any value for you.